Tonight's shiur is not on halacha, an halachic topic. It's on a topic of machshava, and it's really what sort of got my mind thinking is in advance of talk that Dr. Ken Green, who's a member of our shul, will be giving this Thursday night on Leo Strauss and Maimonides. Now, that may be a topic that most of us are not familiar with. Many of us have not heard of Leo Strauss, or if we've heard of Leo Strauss, we know that he was a modern Jewish thinker, and he wrote a lot about Jewish philosophy in the modern period, but he was also very big on the Rambam, and one of his major projects was to use the Rambam and other medieval philosophy as a way of trying to clarify philosophical issues in the modern age. And Dr. Green has sort of devoted his career to the study of Leo Strauss, and so he's just came out with 2 new books, not just one book. One book is the complete writings of Leo Strauss on Maimonides, and the other one is sort of his commentary and his interpretation of Leo Strauss on Maimonides. So it should be a very interesting evening. He's a big scholar, and it's he sits there in his seat, doesn't say a word, and no one knows who he is, but he's a big scholar. Anyway, so that's why I'm looking forward to his talk this Thursday night. But in advance of that, I thought it would be worthwhile to focus on one area that Strauss, I guess for people in my circles, is most famous for, a controversial issue which has to do with what Strauss called esotericism. And it became a huge area of study in the 20th century, which is to study the esotericism, or the esoteric writings of the Rambam. Strauss came out with a very seminal essay. He wrote an introduction to the Moreh Nevuchim, and he also wrote an essay called The Art of, I forget what it's called, The Art of Political Writing. In other words, he came out with an essay about the art of writing in an era where you need to be able to get across certain ideas that may not be popular, and so you can't say them outright, so you write therefore on multiple levels of understanding, so that there's one level of pshat that the Hamon Am is able to understand, and then there's a deeper level that is only accessible to people who are the more literate and the more elite group of people. If we were to turn this into a critical explanation, we would say that the Rambam was more of an elitist in his thinking, is that he felt that most Jewish people the higher level of writing was not accessible, and therefore he had to write on one level. And then there's a deeper level of writing. This is what Strauss's argument was, that the Rambam hid because he had a deeper agenda, and if it was discovered what his real agenda was, he might be ostracized or excluded or misunderstood, or could present a threat to the thoughts of the general population. Strauss was very extreme in this idea, and he believed that the Rambam was more of a philosopher than he let on. That really the Rambam, while attacking certain philosophical ideas, actually really subscribed to the very ideas that he was critical of, but he couldn't say so outright, so he wrote in a very esoteric fashion, which means like multiple levels, on deeper levels, in order to be able to sneak in certain things. And Strauss points to the Hakdama, the Rambam's introduction to his Moreh Nevuchim, as a support for that contention. Now, Strauss was roundly criticized by a number of other Maimonidean scholars of his age and those who came after him. Most of them were being Orthodox Jews who were also scholars, people like Isidore Twersky and Shlomo Pines and Chaim Davidson and more recently Menachem Kellner. A lot of these people who are from a Yidden but are also very, very well versed in the Rambam's philosophical writings feel that it's a mistake to suggest that the Rambam was involved in this kind of this kind of esoteric writing to the degree that Strauss is suggesting. That on the one hand he should counter philosophical ideas and at the same time really secretly subscribe to them. But everyone agrees that there's some level of esotericism to the way the Rambam writes, and that the Rambam admires that kind of writing. And so therefore I thought we could study a couple of sections from the Psich of the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim to be able to at least show what Strauss is getting at, even if we don't end up completely agreeing with to the extreme level to which Strauss takes it, we can at least appreciate where he's coming from. So we're coming in the middle of the Rambam's Pesicha to Moreh Nevuchim, to the Guide for the Perplexed. And the first paragraph that we're going to see two sections of the Pesicha. One is the short part from the middle of the Pesicha, and then one is at the end of the Pesicha. And this is all, the Moreh Nevuchim was written in Arabic, so this is a translation. The next section of Moreh Nevuchim that we're going to see I have for you in English. And the reason I split it is because I just felt that since this is a shiur, we should try to exercise our Hebrew. But the truth of the matter is that while one may argue that there's a bit of an advantage to Hebrew, studying a text in Hebrew, even though the original text is Arabic, but it could become cumbersome if there's a longer text that we'd have to read in Hebrew together. So the longer two essays from the Moreh Nevuchim itself I have for you in English, and we'll go over a little bit sections of those together as well. Okay? But bear in mind, there really is very little advantage of you learning it in Hebrew over English, because unless we really studied in the original Arabic, we're at a disadvantage no matter what. This translation from Arabic to Hebrew is from Professor Michael Schwartz, who is, I believe, at I want to say Bar Ilan, but I could be mistaken. Could be at Hebrew U. And it's available online. So if you just do Michael Schwartz, Schwarz, Moreh Nevuchim, or Guide for the Perplexed, you can get a full Moreh Nevuchim online, fully searchable and indexed and so forth. Okay? So he starts off as follows. Omar Hechacham. The wise man said, he's referring to Shlomo HaMelech, Tapuchei zahav b'maskios kesef davar davur al ofanav, or al ofnav. Shlomo HaMelech writes in the 25th chapter of Mishlei that golden apples embedded in silver settings, each word stated in its proper place. Now that in itself is a very bizarre pasuk. Golden apples in silver settings. What does that mean? So the Rambam is going to tell us what this means. He says, Shema biur inyan zeh she'izkiru. Listen to the explanation, he says. Maskios heim hapisuchim ha'asuyim ma'asei sivacha. He says, what is a maskia? A maskia, this setting, a silver setting, is really a mesh made out of silver that is an outlay that goes over something that is beneath it. Kolomar sheyesh bahem makomos psuchim dakikim ke'einayim ze'iros. So it's almost like a very, very tight lattice work of silver, or mesh of silver, that is covering something right beneath it, and so that there are little holes that, if you look closely enough, you can see through the holes and see what's beneath the meshwork made out of silver. Kegon ma'aseh hatzorfim hakruyim kach, mikivan shehamabat choder ba'adam. And jewelers or silversmiths are well versed in manufacturing this kind of meshwork, because what it does is that it acts as a facade for something that is beneath it. Targum vayashkef v'yistachi, and therefore that's the idea of maskios, comes from the word to be able to gaze and to look beneath the surface. Hu amar efo shetapuach zahav beresha shel kesef shenekaveha dakikim ma'od hu mashal l'dibur ha'amur al shtei panim. And what Shlomo HaMelech is basically telling us is that just like when you have meshwork that overlays gold, when you look at it from the surface, all you see is silver. You look more carefully and you see gold underneath, golden apples underneath. So too is sometimes certain kinds of rhetoric or speech, which is meant to be interpreted on multiple or at least two different levels. You see the silver on the exterior, and then when you look more carefully, on more careful examination, you find the gold underneath. That's what really Shlomo HaMelech is referring to. It's interesting to note that the Medrash, the Rambam is not making this up. The Medrash learns the pasuk this way as well. At the beginning of Parshas Vayigash, when Yosef confronts Yehuda, the Medrash quotes this very same pasuk, and it says that that's exactly the way that Yosef spoke to Yehuda when he confronted him. he, on the face value, was extremely conciliatory and very polite and very subservient and very, like, my master, my master, my master. But underneath, he put in a couple of words there where you could tell that he was prepared to kill all of Egypt if they didn't release Binyamin. So the Medrash says that was there's a certain admiration that Shlomo HaMelech has for a person who's able to speak on different levels at the same time, communicating sometimes even two opposite messages at the same time. Re'ei eifo manifla dibur zeh hameta'eres hamashal hamishuchlal. So he says, look at this beautiful pasuk which describes this very elaborate parable. Shekein omerhu shedibur ba'al shtei panim. That you could have a speech, one speech that could be interpreted in two ways. Dahainu, sheyesh lo pshat, v'yesh lo mashma'us nisteres. So that it has the simple explanation and it has the deeper meaning. Sarich shepshato yiyeh yafeh kakesef. So you need the simple meaning to be pretty like silver. Umashma'uso hanisteres tzricha liyos yafeh mipshato. And the deeper meaning has to be even nicer than the surface meaning. Ad shemashma'uso hanisteres tihiyeh biyachas lipshato kizahav biyachas lekesef. So that the deeper meaning, the hidden meaning, is nicer compared to gold, just like gold is nicer than silver. Bipshat tzarich sheyeh mashi yatzbi'a lemitbonen al hamashma'ut hanisteret. That when you give the simple meaning, it will be something that alludes to the more deeper hidden meaning. Ka'oso tapuach zahav shehubash reshes asuya kesef balas mekabim ze'irim. Just like an apple that has an overlay mesh of silver over it, where there's accessibility to the golden apple that's right beneath it. Kasher roim osa merachoko b'li hisponenus mufleges. So when you look at it from a distance, without thinking or without focusing on it carefully, choshvim shehi tapuach kesef. You look at it and it looks like it's something that's made out of silver. Ach kasher mi she'eno chada misponen ba isponen hetev. But if a person has a discerning, discriminating eye, looks at it more carefully, mispar lo masha b'socha, then he's able to see what's inside of it really. Hu yodeya shehatapuach asui zahav. Then he realizes that the apple is really made out of gold and not silver. So the Rambam says this is the way the Nevi'im spoke when they spoke in Tanakh. He says, "Hapshatim shalahem chokhmah hamoliyah bidvarim rabim." That when you looked at the surface words of what the Nevi'im are saying, it was wisdom that was helpful in many different areas. L'rabos tikun matzav hachavrusa enoshios, to help with social issues that the culture of the time was undergoing. And similarly, the book of Mishlei comes across on the surface as that way, and many other biblical texts. But hamashmos hanisteres shel Mishlei hanavim hi chokhmah hamoila be'emunos ha'emes la'amita. But he says, but when you examine the words of Tanakh more carefully, look at the book of Mishlei more carefully, it provides you with deeper esoteric meaning that is far more true to a much deeper understanding of whatever needs to be communicated about truth and about emes, about emuna, and things like that. Now Strauss points to this passage to tell us that if the Rambam has an admiration of the Nevi'im being able to speak in this fashion, so then surely he himself would say that I would want to emulate the Nevi'im. And therefore it stands to reason that he himself would engage in this kind of dual level of conversation or of communication. But he really says it himself. And this is the last part of we now jump to the last part of the Psicha. Are there any questions at this point? We'll just jump to the last part of the Psicha and let's see what the Rambam says. Yeah?
Yeah, it seems to me that the Nevi'im are divinely inspired.
Mm-hmm.
It's very different than just a very smart person.
True. But you would assume that a divinely inspired person would speak with the utmost of wisdom. So, if a person is
and subtlety, perhaps as well.
And subtlety as well. By the way, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi deals with this issue in a totally different way. The question, there's a subtexted question here that really is unspoken, which is, why is it that when you read certain texts of the Nevi'im and the Ksuvim, they don't seem to be as profound or inspiring as, let's say, certain works of Aristotle or Shakespeare or things like that? And this is a question that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi asks in the Kuzari. Why is it that sometimes the words of the Nevi'im seem to be just like some rabbi coming along and telling people that they have to repent and that there's a social problem that we have to deal with, and yet there don't seem to be the deeper, sort of more profound issues about the meaning of life and things like that. And what the Rambam is basically saying is they are there. They are there. You just have to dig deeper for them, because the function of the Navi was not to write for the philosophical elite. It was to speak to all of Klal Yisrael. But embedded within his words are words for the philosophical elite as well. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi has a totally different approach, which we won't get into right now. Yeah.
In this Sikha, is he referring to only the words of people, like whether they be Nevi'im or otherwise? Because otherwise, maybe I'm just not understanding where he's getting at. There's more than an assumption that there's many levels to look at how we look at Torah.
Pardes, right?
Right. So I mean, there's many ways. So, what is he saying that is over and above what we already know, unless he's addressing it to a specific subset? In other words, it's not Torah; it's only something else.
Well, if you look at the ensuing paragraphs, he tries to explain to us that Chazal also speak in this way. There's a pshat remez drush and sod in the words of Chazal themselves. That's what the Rambam wants to try and communicate to us. He doesn't, by the way, his understanding of pardes is different. He has a different definition of what the word pardes means. So whether or not he even subscribes to that idea of pshat remez drush and sod, I mean, the Rambam himself. But clearly, you're right. When it comes to the words of Torah, clearly there's multiple levels. He's saying that it applies to the Nevi'im too, and it even applies to the words of Chazal. And that's what a number of Meforshim explain, that Chazal spoke on multiple levels also. So therefore, when you find something that seems to be somewhat simplistic that Chazal are getting across, like if Chazal say that Rav Chisda used to say that when I was poor I never ate vegetables, and when I was rich I never ate vegetables because vegetables aren't so good for you. Like, what's the point? Right? So then you have to go look into the deeper Meforshim, and they tell you that he was really talking about something quite profound and esoteric, about different types of things that he ingested intellectually, not so much physically. Okay, now let's take a look at how the Rambam will perhaps apply this to his own writing. Stira o nigud hanimtsoim b'sefer min hasfarim o b'chibur min hachiburim sibasam echas misheva sibos. The Rambam tells us now, just as by way of general introduction, that anytime you encounter contradictions in any body of literature, when you find texts within the same body of literature that contradicts another part of that same literature, it'll be for one of 7 reasons. So let's take a look. We'll go through quickly the 7 reasons. Reason number 1, Hasiba harishona hi shahamachaber osaf divrehem shel anoshim ba'alei deo shonos. He says one reason could be is because the author of this literature was a compiler, and he compiled together opinions of multiple different authors, and achish mit shemos ba'aleihem v'lo yiches kol davar el omro. But he didn't give attribution of so and so says this, and A says this and B says that. He just wrote different aphorisms or different statements without giving attribution, so they appear to be contradictory when they're really authored by 2 different parties. B'chibur hahiti matzei stiro nigud mikiven shechas mishtei kvios u'lishitas ploni v'akviashen shnia l'shitas almodi. He says the reason why there's a contradiction is because Ploni says this thing and Almoni says the other thing. So yeah, they do contradict each other because they're 2 different authors. The Rambam writes later on in his introduction is that this is something that you'll find quite often when you look in the words of Chazal. You see sometimes stiras in Gemaras all the time. You see a Gemara in Daf so-and-so says this, and a Gemara in Daf so-and-so says something totally different. And sometimes you have to come up with the conclusion that it's not a stira because they're said by 2 different people. The Gemara itself will make that point. Number 2. הסיבה השנייה הוא שמחבר אוסו ספר היסולו דעה וחוזר בו ממנו ודבריו הראשונים והשניים נרשמו. Another reason when you're dealing with a human author is that he wrote the work over the course of several years, a long extended period of time. And he wrote down his first opinion. Maybe when he was young he wrote down one opinion. And as he got older, his opinion changed, his ideas changed, and so he wrote the second. And then you look at the collected writings of Ploni Almoni, and you see that an essay that he wrote when he was 20 years old is very different from an essay that he wrote when he was 70 years old. Very simple, right? Which, some people have tried to suggest is that this is the very thing that happened to the Rambam himself. He wrote many different writings over the course of a lifetime, and it wouldn't be surprising if his attitude changed over the course of his lifetime. But we'll put that aside. Number 3. Hasiba hashlishis hi shein dvarim ela kulam kipshutam, ela kitzasam kipshutam uktzasam mashal, sheyesh lo mashmos nisteres. Another reason that you find a contradiction is because one statement might be meant to be taken literally, and the other statement is not meant to be taken literally, but is really just a parable for something deeper. Yesh gam shishtei hakfios hasosra zuzu kipshutan hein mishalim v'chasher mevinu mosam kipshutan hein sosros onogdo zuzu. Sometimes both statements are meant to be taken as parable, and if you take them literally, they do contradict each other. But if you understand that the author did not mean to write literally, but was really writing metaphorically, so then you understand that it's not a contradiction. Reason number 4. Hasiba haraviyas hi sheyesh tanai shelo ne'emar b'meforash b'mekamo mitoch echrech kolshehu o shahanosim shonim ze mizeh ve'echad mehem lo husbar b'mekomo kach shebedvarim nir'ei stira af she'ein stira. Another reason why is that there really is no contradiction, but the author was talking about apples and oranges. In one place, he was talking about one situation or one scenario where there were certain conditions that needed to be met, and therefore X applies to that. And in another situation, it's oranges and it's Y, and the rules are changed. So therefore, he may say two different things because they apply to two different circumstances. They appear at face value to be contradictory, but when you realize that the applications are totally different, you realize that there's no contradiction. Okay? Reason number 5. Reason number 5 and 7 are especially important for us for tonight, as you'll see in just a moment. Reason number 5. Hasiba hachamishasi hechrech she'asui lihivatzer b'shah shemalamdim umivim lidei havana. Listen to this very carefully. This is reason number 5 is that when you first begin teaching someone a subject, you have to simplify the information, sometimes even oversimplify the information. Sometimes there could be a certain concept which is very difficult to illustrate, very difficult to understand. The author may need to invoke a certain idea which is extremely deep only as a preface for a much more simple principle. And in those situations, so he says, and normally you want to start with more simplistic ideas before you get into more sophisticated ideas. And therefore, since he's only bringing in the more complex or sophisticated idea as to try and explain a very simple idea, he will oversimplify the complex idea when he initially presents it without going into much detail of what it really means. Therefore, he won't be exacting in the way that he really defines the principle, because he wants to be able to simplify it to make it accessible to the listener. So that you just take out what you need to understand. And the author assumes that later on he'll be able to expand and clarify the more sophisticated idea at its proper place when he gets into more sophisticated principles. The example that I immediately thought of for this principle is like this. When I'm teaching my children about God, and I tell them, where is Hashem? Hashem is in Shamayim, right? Well, that's the simple principle. How do you explain ubiquity? How do you explain the idea of a timeless and spaceless God? How do you explain certain metaphysical concepts to a child? So you say Hashem is in Shamayim. Then at some point later, the child becomes an adult, and you say, well, God transcends time and space. And you describe time and space as interconnected using Einstein's principles and physics and things like that. And the child says, well, how come you told me that Hashem was in Shamayim when I was 6 years old? So it's not a contradiction. When I said to you that Hashem is in Shamayim, I meant to say that He's transcendent in some way of the human experience, of the physical, and so forth. But I didn't literally mean to say that Hashem is confined to Shamayim. That's really the way that we simplify it. So on face value, it may appear to be a contradiction, but it's really not a contradiction, right? So that's the Rambam basically saying, is that sometimes an author will seem to contradict himself, but he's really not. Okay? And number 6, which is really unflattering, why an author contradicts himself, he says, Asiba hashishis hi shahastira chavuya. He says sometimes the contradiction is actually unknown to the author. And you only discover the contradiction after a lot of examination and study. The more delving and analysis you need to do in order to arrive at the contradiction, the more subtle the contradiction is and the more difficult it is to access. The author mistakenly thinks when he writes both texts that there is no contradiction. וכן עושים לגבי כל מסקנה שמוסיפים עליה הנחה מוקדמת אמיתוס ומסחייבת מסקנה, מגיע הדבר לאחר מספר שלבים לידי סתירה או ניגוד בין המסקנות האחרונות. He says, but at face value there may not appear to be a contradiction, but after you apply different logical syllogisms and principles and you build all the structures that you need to construct in order to be able to get to the final point that the author is making, you discover that the two ideas actually end up logically contradicting or negating each other. Okay? And the author is completely sometimes oblivious to it. However, he says, "Aval shtei hakvios harishonos tistorna zu ezu b'tzura geluya, ela shamachaber shochaches harishona v'shasher hashames hashniya b'makom acher b'chiburo zeh pegam gadol meod." He says, I can forgive, so to speak, I can forgive an author who contradicts himself on a very subtle point where it's very, very hard to catch the contradiction. He says, that's forgivable. He says, but sometimes an author will simply forget what he wrote in chapter 1 when he writes chapter 10, and even at face value, you just have to flip pages to see that he's completely contradicting himself. He says, Zeb Pegam Gadol Ma'od. That's a real defect in the intellect of the author. And Adam Kazeh Eino Nimneh Bein Ha'anashim Sherui Li'itchashev B'Divreihem. Such a person is not counted among people that you should be studying from. Right? Okay, and finally, reason number 7. Hasiba Hashaviyas Hi Hachrech Ladun B'Dvarim Amukim Ma'od. And this is this is the point we wanted to get to. He says reason number 7 is because sometimes one is forced to deliberate over very deep matters, esoteric, profound, maybe metaphysical matters. Asher yesh lahastir chelek mi'inyanehem ulegalos chelek. Sometimes you have to conceal a portion of the idea and only expose a portion of the idea. Lefa'amim yesh hechrech al smach amira mesuyemet ladun be'inyanim eila b'derech shel kvias hanacha mukdemes kolshehi. He says sometimes there's, based upon the situation of the discussion, one may have to discuss ladun binyanim eila b'derech shel kvias hanacha mukdemes kolshehi. You may have to just discuss the premise of an idea. ובמקום אחר יש הכרח לדון בהם בדרך של קביעת הנחה מוקדמת סוסרס לזו. And you may have to discuss somewhere else another premise which at face value seems to contradict the previous premise. ראוי שההמון לא ירגיש בשום אופן בנקודת הסתירה ביניהם. And it's proper that the populace should not be able to detect that there is this contradiction in your words. And yesha hamechaber nokeit b'chol tachbula kedei lahastir zos. And sometimes the author, in order to not expose the fact that he is deliberately contradicting himself, sometimes has to cover up this idea. And in other words, what basically the Rambam is, I believe what the Rambam is saying, is that sometimes there are ideas where the author himself is aware that in order to present a point, in order to illustrate a point, he needs to present sometimes opposite or conflicting ideas, but he does it for purposes of illustration, but he doesn't want to be exposed as a person who contradicts himself, and therefore he will hide the contradiction.
So what's the difference between 5 and 7?
5 is where you're speaking in a rudimentary fashion, and you just speak in a very rudimentary fashion with the assumption that you'll clarify yourself later on. 7 is where you know you're contradicting yourself because you're trying to address two different ideas that do contradict each other, and you don't want the reader to know that you're contradicting yourself. So you speak esoterically. You actually know that you're contradicting yourself, and you don't want the reader to detect it. So you speak in a very hidden way. In other words, you could be addressing the very same subject, looking at it from two different sides, where one side contradicts the other side. And they may appear to be contradictions, but perhaps the author finds a way to reconcile them, but he would rather not expose the apparent contradiction, so he covers it up completely.
Because he has no opinion on 7.
What?
There's really no opinion then on 7. Because there's one way that contradicts himself, he doesn't have a fix.
Yeah, but the way that he puts it is...
5, he'll clarify it later, so he has an
The
opinion.
derech shel kvi'as hanacha mukdemes kolshi. You want to be able to set down some kind of... you want to say something that is going to support a certain argument on one side, and then you want to say something that supports the argument from the completely opposite side. Addressing one particular point, you want to be able to present two sides, and you write it in such a way that the reader shouldn't detect that there's any tension whatsoever. That seems to be the way that he's saying it. You deliberately cover up the contradiction. Hastiros hanimsos, the Mishnah uvabraisos. So he says, and then he goes into explaining. He says that when you look at Mishnahs and Brises, you'll find that many times one Mishnah will contradict another Mishnah, one Brisa will contradict the Mishnah, and so forth. He says, Hein al pi hasiba harishona. He says that's because of reason number 1, which we said, which the Mishnah is a compilation of multiple opinions. And kamo sha'ata motze osam omrim tamid kasher reisha seifa v'atshuvatia reisha reploni v'seifa reploni, etc., etc. Let's get to the bottom paragraph. He says, Ach I hahis amus asher b'sifrei hafilosofim anshei ha'emes shebenehem hein machmas hasibos hachamishis v'hashavias. He says, true philosophers who really are in control of their writing and speak truthfully will sometimes contradict themselves either because of reason number 5 or reason number 7. In other words, either because they're speaking rudimentarily in one section and in a more complex fashion in later on, or because they're coming at it from two different vantage points, which they know contradict each other, but they try their best to conceal the contradiction. By contrast, other books which are written by, non-philosophical authors, Zulas Eloshis, except for the ones that we've mentioned, which are Tanakh and the words of Chazal, Hein Machmas Asiba Hashishis. They're just flawed texts. And if you find contradictions, it's because the author was flawed in his thinking. Sometimes you'll even find this in certain midrashim. In Agadic teachings, sometimes you'll find contradictions, and sometimes they may even be self-contradictory, and therefore Hilkach Heim Omrim Ein Makshin Bahagada. And that's why Chazal say that you're not supposed to try and ask questions on Agadata. You don't fray kashas on Agadata, because sometimes there's even deliberate or even contradictions that are unbeknownst to the author himself. Kein yesh bahem stiros machmas asiba hashvius, and sometimes it'll be reasons because they're coming at it from two different vantage points. Okay. Ulam I hahis amus amatsuyos b'sefer zeh, and this is where the Rambam concludes, makes his almost final point, is that when you find contradictions in my book, in the Moreh Nevuchim, Hein machmas hasibos hachamishios v'hashuviyos. It'll also be because of reason 5 and reason 7. Basically, the Rambam is saying, I'm in control of the game. If you ever find me contradicting myself, I know exactly what I'm doing. And therefore, he says, you need to know this and understand it truthfully and to delve into this carefully so that you don't get confused in many of the chapters which may seem to be contradictory, but they're really not. I never contradict myself in Moreh Nevuchim, says the Rambam. Now, you should know, a number of scholars actually challenge this point because they point to a number of contradictions in the Moreh Nevuchim, and they say, the Rambam claims to be in control of this game and knows exactly what he's doing, but remember, he might have written this introduction before he wrote all of the other chapters. So, but we should take him at his word. If he says, I know what I'm doing, and he probably went over this with a fine-tooth comb before he submitted it for publication. So it is fair to assume that he knew when there was a apparent contradiction, and he said, if you study it more carefully, you'll be able to get to the truth. Sometimes there are two vantage points to the same principle, and sometimes I have to discuss a more basic idea that seems to be contradictory to the more complex, fleshed out principle, but there really is no contradiction. So Strauss takes this one step further, and Strauss says that what the Rambam is really trying to allude to over here is that sometimes I'm going to be appearing to remain faithful to Chazal, when in reality I'm going to subscribe secretly to the philosophers. And so therefore there are those who argue in the Straussian world that the Rambam was really more of an Aristotelian than he let on, and he believed in certain things that he himself writes are heretical. This was Strauss's thesis, and of course it's grating on a traditionalist ear, and that's why the traditional scholars of the Rambam all basically reject what Strauss has to say on this matter. One of the things that Strauss points to are two chapters from the second section of Moreh Nevuchim. And it has to do with the creation of the universe. Let me just see how much time we have. Okay, we'll run through this very briefly, so just to give you an illustration of what some people point to in the sort of the esotericism of the Rambam. In the 13th chapter of section 2 of the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam talks about the different theories of how existence comes into being. Now, these are the three theories of existence that are based upon authors who believe in God. There are people who don't believe in God at all, and those, the Rambam says, are completely beyond the pale and not even discussing. But among those philosophers and religious thinkers who believe in a God, there are three different ways of approaching how the world comes into existence. There's the Aristotelian, the Platonic, and the Torah. And so he runs through all three, and he says the first theory is those who believe in the Torah of Moshe, our teacher. This is on page 2. And it is basically a belief in creatio ex nihilo, of a creation of yesh me'ayin. And he basically says, in the beginning, God alone existed and nothing else. Neither angels nor spheres nor the things that are contained within the spheres existed. He then produced from nothing all existing things such as they are by his will and desire. Even time itself is among the things created, which is very telling that the Rambam was able to have that profound knowledge, because that's what we've just discovered just recently in the 20th century, that time came into existence with the Big Bang. Right? For time depends on motion, on an accident in things which move, and the things upon whose motion time depends are themselves created beings, which have passed from non-existence into existence. So therefore we say that God existed before the creation of the universe, although the verb existed appears to imply the notion of time. We also believe that he existed in infinite space of time before the universe was created, but in these cases we do not mean time in its true sense. Okay? We only use the term to signify something analogous or similar to time, etc., etc. It gets very, very deep. Now, before you go to the second theory, go to the third theory, which is that of Aristotle. Now, we'll get to the second theory in just a second. Aristotle, his followers and commentators, Aristotle maintains, like the adherents of the second theory, that a corporeal object cannot be produced without a corporeal substance. Now, what that means for Aristotle is that it's impossible that God at any time created something physical, yesh me'ayin. Physicality must have always existed in order for other physical things to come into existence. There must have always been something called primordial matter, or something that always has existed from time immemorial that is part of the physical world in order to beget other physical things. He goes, however, farther and contends that all the heavens are indestructible, for he holds that the universe in its totality has never been different, nor will it ever change. The heavens, which form the permanent element in the universe and are not subject to genesis and destruction, have always been so. Time and motion are eternal, permanent, and have neither beginning nor end. Aristotle believed that there's no creation because creation denotes a sentience of a God that is subject to have free will. For Aristotle, God exists, but God has no free will. God is an automatic being that just emits creativity and existence. And to say that God at one point decided that he was going to alter things from nothingness to existence implies a certain flaw or a certain diminution of God's perfection, because God is not subject to change. Anything that implies change for Aristotle implies lack of perfection, and therefore for God to change from immateriality to materiality for Aristotle is not possible. It's simply an impossibility of God. So therefore Aristotle maintains that the world as it is always has been, and God has maintained in his control of everything that has always existed. And nothing is changeable, nothing is mutable in our universe. Okay, so that's, for the Rambam, that's an untenable position. And he says so.
How does Aristotle deal with the fact that, where does this primordial...
It's always existed. It's existed for all of eternity.
How does he or anybody else deal with that? Where does it come from? Does you just skip over that piece?
It's just something that's infinite. You can't even say where does it come from, because it's infinite. Where does God come from?
God comes later. In other words, in this theory.
No, God and materiality are concomitant. They exist parallel to each other. God is in control of all that which is material and corporeal, and he maintains it and controls it.
But does this indicate that they exist simultaneously, that God did not create the universe?
No, the term creation is anathema to Aristotle.
He modified what was there.
Not even modified. He controls it. Modification also is impossible for God. God doesn't modify, change, or change into anything. Everything about God is static and constant. That's Aristotle's theory. So, and if you take a look, he says, this whole arrangement, therefore, both above and here below, is never disturbed or interrupted, and nothing is produced contrary to the laws or the ordinary course of nature. He further says, though not in the same terms, that he considers it impossible for God to change his will or conceive a new desire. That God produced this universe in its totality by his will, but not from nothing. Aristotle finds it as impossible to assume that God changes his will or conceives a new desire as to believe that he is non-existing or that his essence is changeable. Hence it follows that this universe has always been the same in the past and will be the same eternally.
So what does Aristotle say God's position is in this world? Just maintains what
He's the great maintainer.
But he can't change or...
He cannot change it. He cannot. No, he not only doesn't, he cannot. Because his perfection will not allow him to do that which is imperfect. It's like saying, can God pick up a rock that's too heavy for him to lift? The answer is no, because his perfection will not allow him to do certain things. This is a manifestation of imperfection to say that God is mutable or changeable. Okay, that's Aristotle's theory. It's a lot of discussion on this, which we'll put on the side for now. Now let's go back to the second theory, which you'll see is somewhere in between the first and the second. The theory of all philosophers whose opinions and works are known to us is this: it is impossible to assume that God produced anything from nothing, or that he reduces anything to nothing. That is to say, it is impossible that an object consisting of matter and form should be produced when that matter is absolutely absent, or that it should be destroyed in such a manner that that matter be absolutely no longer in existence. Physical matter must have always been here, and it always will be here. It's not sort of like almost like the laws of conservation, which says that physical matter can never just come into existence or disappear from existence. To say of God that he can produce a thing from nothing or reduce a thing to nothing is, according to the opinion of these philosophers, the same as if we were to say that he could cause one substance to have the same time two opposite properties, or produce another being like himself, or change himself into a body, or produce a square the diagonal of which be equal to its side, or similar impossibilities. The philosophers thus believe that it is no defect in the Supreme Being that he does not produce impossibilities, because, as he said, God is perfect. And we just skip down, he says, they therefore assume that a certain substance has coexisted with God from eternity in such a manner that neither God existed without that substance nor the latter without God. But they do not hold that the existence of that substance equals in rank that of God, for God is the cause of that existence, and the substance is in the same relation to God as the clay is to the potter or the iron to the smith. God can do with it what he pleases. At one time he forms of it heaven and earth, at another time he forms some other thing. Those who hold this view also assume that the heavens are transient, that they came into existence, though not from nothing, and they cease to exist, although they cannot be reduced to nothing. So you see the difference? You see, this is the third opinion, or the second of the three opinions. This is Plato, that God, not Play-Doh, but Plato, right? Basically, he's saying that the universe is God's playground. God can take the universe and shape it into anything he wants, but he cannot create something out of nothing, nor can he completely cause matter to completely disappear. But he can alter it. He can treat it like Play-Doh and turn it into whatever he wants and then take it apart afterwards. So this is Plato's proposition. And he says, if you look at this last paragraph before we go for the third theory, he says, the followers of this theory are divided into different schools whose opinions and principles it is useless to discuss here, but what I have mentioned is common to all of them. Plato holds the same opinion. And then he says, his opinion, however, does not agree with our belief. Only superficial and careless persons wrongly assume that Plato has the same belief as we have. For whilst we hold that the heavens have been created from absolutely nothing, Plato believes that they have been formed out of something. Now that's very important. The Rambam clearly states down in this chapter that the Torah view and the Platonic view are not consistent, cannot be reconciled. Okay? We believe in creatio ex nihilo, creation yesh me'ayin, and Plato does not believe in creation yesh me'ayin, but he believes in creation yesh me'yesh. Okay, so far so good. Interesting to point out that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari is not so convinced. And I read to you from the first mimer, where Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says that there is a belief in Aristotle who believes in this belief in eternal existence. But then he says, other philosophers, while still believing in eternal existence, nevertheless believe that the universe in its current form was shaped from some primordial matter at some point in history. Were a Jew of faith to believe in some primordial matter that God used to create the current universe, and that this primordial matter had been used previously to create other universes as well, this would not constitute a defect of faith. Ultimately, he would still believe that this world had been created at some finite time, and that humankind stemmed from the first people, Adam and Chava. So for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, it is not heresy to believe that God created this world yesh me'yesh. He says if a Jew wants to believe that, which is the Platonic view, as long as he believes in Bereshis bara Elokim Esa Shamayim V'Esa Aretz, he's not a heretic. He is still consistent with the Torah. The Rambam over here says that such a person is not consistent with our faith.
Are these the only? I mean, there are other views. So, for example, he said you can't.
No, the Rambam is. We're only discussing creation at this point. What hashgacha is something as a totally different subject. Hashgacha is a different subject.
Right, but the rule, in other words, you still see that.
For the Rambam, it's impossible for God to remove himself because even Aristotle submits to that. God and the universe are inseparable. God has to constantly maintain the universe. He's the ultimate mover of everything that exists. The idea of a mechanistic universe that you're describing comes a little bit later in history. But in this period in history, it seems to be anyone who believes in God as the prime mover, the constant mover of everything that exists.
Because some of the let's say if you look at some of the makos that were given, they were brought in three different categories to address the notion that you don't believe in Yesh Me'ayin, you believe in Yesh Me'ayin, but there's minimal control hashgach over it. So there's some suggestion that even as early as going back to times of
well, you have to say who offers that interpretation.
Well, it's quoted in the Kliyakar, but the question is, that's not his own idea.
Okay.
But that's much later, of course. But I think he's referring to.
It could be that there were those who believed in a lack of hashgacha, even in the medieval period, because that's for sure. Aristotle doesn't believe in hashgacha either. God is constantly connected to the universe, but he's not mindful of every individual thing. So that's probably what the Kliyakar is referring to. Not that God removes himself, but that God is not sentient and aware of what's going on in the world. Those are two different things. Now, we don't have time to go into it, but if you take a look at the same section of the Moreh Nevuchim, but chapter 25, which goes much later, the Rambam needs to explain to you why he accepts certain principles of faith that really seem to be contradicted by the Torah, whereas he's not willing to accept the eternity of the universe. He explains as follows. You might think that the reason why I reject Aristotle's theory of the eternal universe is because the psukim indicate as such. He says that's not at all the case. And he says, I'll give you an example of where I hold of a philosophical principle that is completely contradicted by the Torah, at least on some level. I believe in God's incorporeality, says the Rambam, and I've proven it to you using philosophical proofs. But when you look at the face value of many psukim in the Chumash, you see that God has a body. That God took us out of Egypt. B'yad chazaka u'bizroa netuya. God took us out with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, and God created Adam in his image, man in his image. So all of those things imply a corporeal semblance of God. And yet I've demonstrated, he says, that you have to reinterpret those psukim that imply corporeality, and I could theoretically do the same if it was demonstrated to me that the universe is eternal, as Aristotle states. And he goes into a number of explanations, and I encourage you to try and study this on your own. He explains why he cannot accept Aristotle's theory of the eternity of the universe, not based upon proof texts from the Chumash, but rather on the philosophical impossibility, because once you subscribe to the eternity of the universe, it turns out that God is no longer providential, and God no longer has free will to immerse himself within the universe and react to human behavior. That's the reason why it's unacceptable, because it completely unsettles the principles of our faith. That's why I can't accept the eternity of the universe. And in the course of this discussion, the Rambam writes something very interesting about Plato. Let's see, where does he say it? He says, so in the middle of the second paragraph, he writes the words "if, however," which is like right in the middle, right halfway halfway through. He says, "If, however, we accepted the eternity of the universe in accordance with the second of the theories which we have expounded above in chapter 13, which you and I just read together, that's of Plato, and assumed with Plato that the heavens are likewise transient, we should not be in opposition to the fundamental principles of our religion." Did you hear what he just said? You're not connected to Torah if you subscribe to Plato, just like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi had said. Here's an example, says Strauss, where the Rambam is contradicting himself, and he does it deliberately because he's concealing something. This theory would not imply the rejection of miracles, but on the contrary, would admit them as possible. The scriptural text might have been explained accordingly, and many expressions might have been found in the Bible and in other writings that would confirm and support this theory. But he just writes, but there is no necessity for this expedient so long as the theory has not been proved. As there is no proof sufficient to convince us, this theory need not be taken into consideration, nor the other one. We take the text of the Bible literally and say that it teaches us truth which we cannot prove, and the miracles are evidence for the correctness of our view. So he's really changing his tune from chapter 13 to chapter 25. In chapter 13, he says the Platonic view is inconsistent with Torah. In chapter 25, he says it is reconcilable, but there's just no need to. So the question is, what?
What's the hidden message?
That's the question. So if you're a Straussian, what the Rambam is hiding is the fact that he really believes in Aristotle, which is sounds a little bit extreme. Sounds a little bit illogical.
Aristotle or Plato?
No, Aristotle. Yeah. And that's why he's really playing a game. But a number of authors demonstrate that there's no reason to come to those very, very stark and very extreme conclusions about the Rambam. I just thought it was an interesting exercise. There's a wealth of literature. If this stuff interests you, I can give you a whole bibliography on texts which discuss these issues and flesh them out and really try to give us some idea about a whole world of the Rambam that most of us are not familiar with. Okay, we'll daven Ma'ariv.